In the sleepy village of St. Brenton, Massachusetts, time seemed to move more slowly than anywhere else. The air was always thick with the scent of salt from the nearby coast, and every morning the fog rolled through the narrow cobblestone streets as though the world wanted to stay wrapped in memory. It was a place where people still greeted each other by name, where secrets traveled slower than the tide, or so everyone believed. Hanging inside the modest stone church of St. Mary's of the Hill was an old photograph that had watched generations come and go. The picture, framed in cracked wood and protected by a thin sheet of fading glass, showed a moment frozen from the year 1891. It captured a simple village blessing a priest, Father Alaric Byrne, standing before a group of children dressed in Sunday whites, their heads bowed in reverence. His figure stood tall in the center, his eyes gentle, his expression calm. At first glance, it looked like any old church photograph from the late 19th century. Yet for over 40 years, that picture hung there, unnoticed, unstudied, until one quiet afternoon a stranger's eye caught something no one else ever had. It was 1938, and the rain hadn't stopped for 3 days. The old church had become a refuge for travelers waiting for the storm to pass. Among them was Clara Winslow, a young historian from Boston. She had come to St. Brenton to document remnants of early New England parishes for a local museum project. She carried with her a camera, a small notebook, and a curiosity that refused to rest. While the others huddled near the fire, Clara wandered through the aisles, studying the wooden pews and oil lamps that flickered faintly against the stone walls. Her eyes eventually fell upon the photograph. At first, she smiled, admiring the innocence in the children's faces, the solemn beauty of an era long gone. But then something tugged at her attention. The priest's hands. They were raised above the children, as if in blessing, yet something about them seemed strange. The fingers were curled tightly inward, not open as one might expect in a gesture of prayer or benediction. The sleeves of his robe hung heavy around his wrists, concealing the shape of his palms entirely. It was as if he was gripping something small and hidden. Clara leaned closer, pressing her face near the glass. "That's unusual," she whispered to herself. She pulled a magnifying lens from her coat pocket, the kind she used to inspect historical documents, and peered closer. Indeed, there was something odd. The angle of his hands looked tense, deliberate. Not the posture of a man at peace, but one holding pain. Curiosity ignited like a flame. She jotted notes in her book. 1891, Father Alaric Byrne, hands concealed during blessing. Later that day, Clara asked the caretaker, an elderly man named Mr. Finch, about the photograph. He scratched his head, thinking for a moment. "Oh, that old thing," he said. "Been there longer than I've been alive." Folks say Father Byrne was a quiet man, kind too, but he didn't talk much about himself. Clara pressed on. "Do you know why his hands are hidden in every picture?" Mr. Finch chuckled softly. "Every picture, you say? You mean there's more?" And there were. Clara spent the next 2 days in the church's small archive room, a dusty loft above the nave where yellowed documents and fading photos lay piled in wooden boxes. Among them she found 2 more images of Father Byrne, one from 1888, another from 1893, both showing the same pattern. In each, his hands were hidden or wrapped in cloth. A chill ran through her. It couldn't be coincidence. She began asking around the village, visiting old homes and talking to anyone who might remember the priest. Most were polite but dismissive. To them, Father Byrne was a figure of the past, a man who had served faithfully, fallen ill, and passed quietly. But on the 3rd evening, as Clara sat at the local inn writing her notes, a woman approached her table. "You're looking into Father Byrne, aren't you?" the woman asked in a soft, aged voice. Her name was Margaret O'Reilly, nearly 80 years old, with kind eyes clouded by memory. Clara nodded eagerly. "I was one of the children in that photograph," Margaret said. "I remember that day." Clara's heart quickened. "Do you remember why he kept his hands like that?" Margaret hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. "He told us to close our eyes while he blessed us. We thought it was because he wanted us to pray harder. But when I peeked, I saw his hands were wrapped in white cloth. He looked hurt, not angry, not sick exactly, but pained, What kind of pain? Clara asked gently. The kind you hide, Margaret whispered. Those words lingered in Clara's mind long after Margaret left. That night, she returned to the church. The rain had stopped, and moonlight spilled through the stained glass windows, painting the floor in colors of blue and red. She stood before the old photograph again, staring at the priest's solemn face. What was he hiding? Why did no one question it? She reached up and touched the frame, feeling the rough wood beneath her fingers. Somewhere behind that image was a story, one that the people of St. Brenton had either forgotten or chosen to ignore. The next morning, Clara decided to search deeper, combing through church records and personal letters. That was when she discovered a single entry in an old parish log, written in Father Byrne's own hand. My affliction grows, yet I must not waver. The children must not fear. If these hands are unclean, let them serve one last time in silence. The truth began to take shape. Father Byrne hadn't been hiding sin or shame. He had been hiding sickness, the kind that would have exiled him from the village forever. Yet rather than retreat, he stayed, continuing to bless, to comfort, and to heal with the same hands that the world would have condemned. When Clara finally stepped back into the sunlight, the photograph no longer looked mysterious to her. It looked holy, not because of the priest's perfection, but because of his pain. She realized that what stirred the village wasn't the secret he kept, but the love he refused to stop giving despite it. That single photograph, once overlooked by everyone, became the symbol of something larger, a reminder that the truest acts of courage often happen in silence, and the greatest blessings come from imperfect hands. When Father Alaric Byrne first arrived in St. Brenton in the spring of 1887, the townsfolk noticed very little about him at all. He came on a modest horse, wearing a simple black cassock, carrying only a leather satchel and a small wooden cross. There was no grand introduction, no fanfare, no proclamation of faith shouted from the pulpit. He simply walked through the fog-filled main street, nodded to the baker, helped a farmer pick up a fallen barrel, and by evening he had already begun mending the old church roof with his own hands. He was not a man of speeches but of silences. In a world where every preacher tried to fill the air with thunder, Father Byrne preferred the whisper of prayer and the steady rhythm of work. He slept in a narrow cot inside the rectory behind St. Mary's Church, rising before dawn each morning to ring the bell that called the faithful to early Mass. The sound was gentle, never rushed, never harsh, just enough to tell the town that morning had come and that someone cared enough to greet it. Before St. Brenton, Father Byrne had served in Boston, in a parish that had been ravaged by the cholera epidemic of 1886. He lost dozens of parishioners and nearly his own life caring for them. When the last wave of illness passed, he petitioned to be reassigned somewhere quieter, somewhere forgotten. A place where people still listen when you speak softly, he wrote. The diocese sent him to St. Brenton, a fishing village at the edge of the sea, and so he began again quietly. The first thing the villagers noticed was that Father Byrne walked everywhere. He visited homes without invitation, bringing with him a loaf of bread or a few apples, and when people tried to thank him, he'd only smile and say, "It's God's doing, not mine." Children would often run behind him, tugging at his cloak, laughing at how he never raised his voice even when scolding them. He spoke kindly to everyone, the fishermen, the widows, the drunkards outside the tavern. But there was always something distant in his eyes, a sadness that seemed to follow him like a faint shadow. Some said it was the memory of the plague, others whispered it was guilt from losing so many lives. Whatever it was, Father Byrne carried it with grace, never allowing sorrow to harden him. Each night after prayers, the villagers would see a small light glowing from the rectory window. It was said he read by candlelight until dawn, old scriptures, letters from parishioners long gone, and sometimes medical books. He was fascinated by the ways in which pain could be eased. Not cured, he never spoke of curing, but eased. When winter came that first year, the villagers tried to offer him blankets, better shoes, and even a heavier coat. He refused them all. "If I live as they do," he said softly, "then I will understand how to serve them better." His hands were always busy, fixing doors, repairing nets, patching roofs. He refused payment for anything, claiming that God had already paid him in trust. "A coin weighs too much," he would joke. "I prefer to carry only purpose." It wasn't long before the people of St. Brenton began to love him, not out of duty, but out of genuine affection. He became their counselor, their teacher, their quiet guardian. When storms took the fishermen out to sea, he stood on the cliffs until every last boat returned. When crops failed, he was the first to skip meals so that the children could eat. Still, despite all his kindness, there remained an air of mystery around him. He never allowed anyone to shake his bare hand. He wore gloves even in summer, and when asked about it, he would simply smile and say, "My skin burns easily in the sun." As the years passed, whispers began to circle the village. Some said Father Byrne had been wounded in the epidemic and bore scars he didn't wish others to see. Others suggested he had once been part of a wealthy family and hid his identity out of humility. But those who truly knew him didn't care for gossip. To them, he was the man who helped rebuild the schoolhouse after it burned down in 1889. He was the one who tended to the injured when a storm tore through the harbor. He was the one who sat beside the sick for hours, holding their trembling hands, whispering prayers until their breathing steadied. The children adored him. They would bring him seashells and wildflowers, which he kept on his desk until they withered. He had a way of making each child believe they were special. "You were made on purpose," he'd tell them, "so live like it." But kindness often comes with a cost. Late at night, when the village slept, Father Byrne could be found in the small stone garden behind the church, kneeling before a weathered cross. He prayed not for himself, but for strength to keep serving without letting despair consume him. There were nights he coughed so hard it echoed through the empty church. His gloves sometimes bled through with faint stains of red, and once or twice, the baker's wife claimed she saw bandages hidden beneath his sleeves. When asked if he was ill, he would smile and say, "We all are, in one way or another." The truth, of course, was far more painful than anyone imagined, but that revelation would come later. For now, he endured quietly, refusing pity, giving every ounce of his strength to others. By 1891, the year the famous photograph was taken, Father Byrne had already transformed the soul of St. Brenton. The church that once stood half empty was now filled every Sunday. People didn't come for doctrine or grandeur. They came for him, for the gentle man who showed that faith wasn't about power but presence. He often told his congregation, "A loud heart can't hear God whisper." That line stayed with many long after he was gone. In every home he visited, he left behind something invisible, a peace that outlasted his footsteps. And though he never preached about miracles, the villagers would later say that his greatest miracle was how he taught them to see holiness in ordinary days. When the photograph was finally taken that summer, no one noticed his trembling hands, his hidden pain, or the illness quietly consuming him. They only saw a priest blessing their children, a man who seemed to belong more to heaven than to earth. But what they didn't realize was that the man who lived so quietly had been fighting the loudest battle of all, the battle to love selflessly, while slowly fading away. And perhaps that is why his story still moves hearts today. Because Father Byrne showed that you don't need recognition to make a difference. You only need the courage to keep giving, even when no one sees. By the time the year 1891 arrived, Father Alaric Byrne had become a quiet legend in St. Brenton. He was the man who never asked for rest, who carried the burdens of others with a gentleness that made even the most hardened fishermen pause in respect. But beneath the calm rhythm of his daily routine, his dawn prayers, his visits to the sick, his long walks along the foggy coast, there existed a secret so carefully hidden that no one in the village had ever truly seen it. The secret was in his hands. It began one winter morning in 1888. A bitter storm had rolled in from the sea, coating the windows of the rectory in frost. Father Byrne was writing a letter to the diocese, his ink trembling slightly as he dipped the pen again and again. When the candlelight flickered across his fingers, he noticed something he had never seen before. Small, pale patches forming along the knuckles of his right hand. At first, he thought little of it. The cold had always cracked his skin, and he assumed it was nothing more than dryness. He rubbed ointment over it, wrapped the area in linen, and continued his duties. But as weeks turned into months, the spots spread up his wrists, across his palms, and toward his fingertips. They did not hurt, not exactly, but there was a numbness, a fading sensation, as though life itself were retreating from his touch. He began wearing gloves, at first to keep warm, then to conceal what he could no longer deny. He had seen it before, during the cholera epidemic in Boston, not cholera itself, but the other illness whispered about in hospitals and alleyways. Leprosy. In those days, the word carried more terror than truth. Those diagnosed were exiled, stripped of their names, their homes, even their sacraments. Father Byrne knew that if his condition were discovered, he would be removed from the parish immediately, condemned to live out his remaining years in isolation. He prayed that night harder than he ever had before, not for healing but for courage. "Let me serve until I can no longer stand," he whispered, "and let no child fear my touch." From that day forward, the gloves became a part of him. They were soft brown leather in winter and thin white cotton in summer. When asked about them, he always smiled and said the same thing: "The sun and I have never been friends." The villagers accepted it. After all, their priest was a peculiar man in many ways, gentle, private, uncomplaining. Yet there were moments when someone would notice the way he winced slightly while gripping a cup, or how he avoided shaking hands, offering instead a respectful nod or a brief touch to the shoulder. One spring afternoon, Margaret O'Reilly, then a child of 8, brought him a bouquet of daisies from the meadow. He reached to take them, then hesitated for a fraction of a second before using his sleeve to hold the stems. She didn't understand why, but years later she would remember that tiny pause. Inside the church, Father Byrne began blessing his congregation with his hands held higher, farther from their faces. He no longer laid his palms gently upon heads or shoulders as he once had. His blessings became distant, yet his voice, soft, trembling with conviction, seemed to carry even greater power. People said his prayers had grown stronger. In truth, they had grown sadder. By 1889, the disease had begun to change him. The skin beneath his gloves grew thick and discolored, feeling faded from his fingertips. He dropped objects without realizing it. Writing became difficult. But still, every morning, he lit the church candles with shaking hands, refusing to let the flame go out. Only one person ever suspected the truth, a young nun named Sister Eliza, who helped him care for orphans at the parish school. One night, she entered the rectory carrying soup and found him sitting by the fire, his gloves removed for the first time. His hands were bandaged completely, thin trails of blood staining the fabric. Their eyes met and silence filled the room. "Father," she whispered, "you must tell someone. You need help." He looked at her, calm but resolute. "If I tell them, they will send me away. And who will care for them then? The sick, the lonely, the children." Tears welled in her eyes. "You can't do this alone. I am not alone," he replied gently. "God knows. That is enough." From that night on, Sister Eliza kept his secret. She began leaving new bandages on his desk each week and ensured that no one saw him without his gloves. It was their silent covenant, a pact of compassion between two souls bound by faith and sorrow. Then came the summer of 1891, the day the photograph was taken. It was meant to be a moment of joy, a record of the village's children after their first communion. The townsfolk dressed in their best clothes, the sky clear after weeks of rain. Father Byrne stood before them, smiling faintly, his gloves immaculate and pressed. As the photographer adjusted his lens, one child tugged at his robe, asking, "Father, why do you always wear gloves, even when it's hot?" He knelt down, looked the boy in the eye, and said softly, "Because my hands are not as young as yours, but they still remember how to bless." When the camera clicked, his hands were lifted in prayer, concealing the bandages beneath. None of them would know for decades that in that frozen moment, immortalized forever, he was blessing them while his own body was quietly failing him. Over the following year, the disease worsened. He began to lose feeling in his legs, walking became painful. Yet he never stopped. Each dawn, he made his rounds through the village, feeding the poor, comforting the dying, holding babies with cloth, wrapped fingers so they would never know fear. The gloves became his shield but also his chain. Every day he fought the temptation to confess, to surrender the secret and rest. But each time he looked upon the faces of those who needed him, he chose to remain silent. He believed his suffering had a purpose. "If my pain can spare another," he once wrote in his private journal, "then let it stay with me." Love is not measured by what we give freely, but by what we give quietly. Years later, when the truth finally surfaced, the villagers would say that the gloves were not symbols of deceit, but of devotion, a man's refusal to let illness interrupt compassion. They would touch the old photograph and whisper prayers of gratitude for the priest who carried his secret so others could live unafraid. Because in the end, Father Byrne's greatest miracle wasn't that he blessed the children. It was that he continued to love them, even when the world would have told him to hide. And that is why the people of St. Brenton still speak of the priest with the hidden hands, the man who proved that the purest form of faith is not in what we show, but in what we protect for the sake of love. When people spoke of Father Alaric Byrne, they often remembered his voice, soft as dusk, steady as a tide, but few ever realized how much those quiet words were carried by hands that could barely feel. By 1892, the illness had claimed most of the strength in his fingers. He could no longer hold a quill properly. His handwriting had become faint, like the fading edge of a prayer. Yet somehow, those same frail hands continued to build, feed, comfort, and bless more souls than anyone in the village could count. To most of St. Brenton, he was still the same humble priest. To the few who saw the truth, he had become something else entirely, a man who turned pain into purpose and sickness into service. Behind St. Mary's Church, past the ivy-covered walls and the old apple tree that leaned toward the sea, stood a small, weathered building. It had once been a storage shed for candles and old hymnals. But under Father Byrne's direction, it became something sacred, a place where the unwanted and the sick could come without judgment. He called it the House of Mercy, though no sign ever marked its door. The villagers thought it was just where he kept supplies. Only Sister Eliza knew the truth. Every night after evening mass, when the streets emptied and the waves crashed softly beyond the cliffs, the two of them lit candles inside that hidden room. One by one, people would knock, quietly, timidly, seeking help for wounds they couldn't afford to treat or illnesses they were too ashamed to name. Father Byrne would greet each of them with the same calm tone. "Come in. No one is unclean here." His gloved hands would unwrap their bandages, clean their sores, and apply herbal salves he learned to make from old medical texts. When they wept, he held them close. When they shook with fever, he whispered prayers against their skin. And though he could no longer feel warmth, those who left swore they had felt his hands glow with a comfort deeper than touch. By the following winter, word had spread quietly through the fishing docks and the farms beyond the hill. "If you are sick, go to the priest at night." They came in secret. Mothers with coughing babies, sailors with infected cuts, beggars with frost-bitten feet. They came not just for medicine, but for mercy. The House of Mercy became a sanctuary for those society had forgotten. Once, a widow named Hannah McCallum brought her little girl, Ruth, whose body was covered in a rash the local doctor refused to treat for fear of contagion. Father Byrne took Ruth into his arms and sang a lullaby until she slept. No one, he told Hannah, should be afraid to be touched. That moment became a turning point for the village. Hannah told her neighbors what the priest had done, not in rumor, but in awe. People began to see him differently, not just as a holy man, but as a living example of grace. The very hands he feared would bring fear instead brought healing, acceptance, and peace. One night, a terrible accident struck the village. A fishing vessel crashed into the rocks near the bay during a storm, and several men were pulled from the water half drowned and bleeding. The doctor was away in another town, and panic swept through the streets. Without hesitation, Father Byrne and Sister Eliza carried the injured to the House of Mercy. For hours, through the howl of the storm and the dim light of lanterns, he worked, binding wounds, setting bones, and whispering prayers between breaths. His hands trembled violently. Several times he had to bite his lip to keep from crying out as pain shot through his numbed fingers. Yet he refused to stop. When dawn came, the men were alive. The villagers who saw the scene would never forget it. The priest sitting in the corner, gloves soaked with blood and seawater, whispering, "Thank you, Lord, thank you for letting me still serve." After that night, no one questioned his gloves again. Whatever mystery they held, they were now seen as sacred instruments of mercy. As months passed, the illness continued to advance. His joints stiffened, his grip weakened. Sister Eliza began helping him with the smallest tasks, tying his shoes, lifting communion chalices, turning the pages of scripture. But he never allowed self-pity to darken his tone. "If these hands can no longer hold," he said one morning, "then let them lift in prayer. That is enough." He taught others to serve in his place, young men and women who would later become nurses and caretakers long after he was gone. He made them repeat his rule: touch is not shameful. Compassion is not contagious. In teaching them, he built something larger than a parish. He built a philosophy of kindness that outlived him. Eventually, his condition became impossible to hide from higher authorities. The bishop's office sent letters requesting his transfer to a sanitarium. Father Byrne delayed his reply for weeks, writing and rewriting drafts until one evening, he finally sealed the envelope. In the letter, he confessed everything. "I have lived among them unworthy but willing. My hands no longer serve me, yet they still serve him. I ask not for pardon, only for permission, to stay until I can no longer walk. For love once given must not be withdrawn." The bishop never answered. Whether out of mercy or avoidance, no messenger ever came. Perhaps even the church understood that holiness sometimes lives beyond the law. On the first Sunday of 1893, Father Byrne delivered what would be his last full sermon. The church overflowed. Families who had not attended Mass in years came to hear him speak. His voice was weak but clear, carried by conviction rather than strength. "God," he told them, "does not ask for perfect vessels. He asks for open ones. The world will tell you that brokenness disqualifies you, but I tell you, it prepares you. For the hands that tremble in pain are often the same hands that can lift others out of it." When the service ended, he raised his gloved hands one final time to bless the congregation. No one looked away, no one whispered. In that silence, every soul present knew they were witnessing something sacred, the triumph of compassion over fear. Father Byrne passed quietly a few months later, surrounded by Sister Eliza and a handful of villagers. His gloves were folded neatly beside him. The house of mercy remained open for years, tended by those he had taught. And even decades after his death, people would still speak of him in hushed tones. Some swore that when they entered the old church on a cold morning, they could feel warmth settle over their shoulders as though unseen hands had touched them gently. Whether they believed in miracles or not, everyone agreed on one truth: the hands that suffered most were the hands that healed best. Because Father Byrne's story was never about disease. It was about devotion. About a man who proved that the smallest acts of mercy, even from trembling fingers, could mend not just bodies, but hearts. And so, long after his name faded from record books, the people of St. Brenton remembered his message. Do not hide your pain, use it to heal. The Church of St. Mary's of the Hill stood quietly for decades after Father Alaric Byrne was laid to rest. Time dulled its stones and softened its memories. Rain darkened the roof tiles, ivy climbed the bell tower, and new priests came and went, each serving faithfully, though none quite like the man whose presence still seemed to linger in every shadowed corner. By the time 1939 arrived, nearly half a century had passed since the day of his final sermon. Most of those who had known him were gone. The world had moved through wars, progress, and sorrow. Yet in the village of St. Brenton, his name was still spoken in quiet reverence. Children were told stories of the priest with the healing hands, though few knew whether the tales were myth or memory. Then, one cold March morning, a discovery would breathe life into his legend once more. After years of neglect, St. Mary's needed repairs. The wooden floors had begun to rot, and the salt air from the coast had eaten through the iron hinges on the doors. The church council hired a team of local carpenters to restore the building to its former beauty. Among them was Thomas Reed, a craftsman in his early 40s. Practical and skeptical by nature, He was not a man given to superstition, though he'd heard the stories. "That priest of yours," he joked to the foreman, "if he was half as holy as you lot claim, maybe these boards wouldn't have rotted in the first place." The foreman only smiled. "You'll see," he said, "this place has secrets." On the third day of work, Thomas's hammer struck something that did not sound like wood. Kneeling down, he pried open one of the old planks near the altar. Beneath it, nestled between layers of dust, was a small wooden box, no larger than a loaf of bread. The lid bore the faint engraving of a cross, worn nearly smooth with age. The workers gathered around, silent now. The air in the church seemed to change, thick with anticipation. "Looks like a donation box," one said. "Or maybe someone's hiding their wages." Thomas brushed away the dust and gently opened the lid. Inside was a bundle wrapped in linen, yellowed with time. As he unwrapped it, the smell of old paper and faint traces of incense filled the air. Inside lay a single folded letter bound by a strip of rosary twine, and beside it, 2 gloves, fragile and stiff with age. The gloves alone would have been enough to stir memories among the elders who still attended Mass there. They had heard of the priest who never removed his gloves, who blessed the sick and the poor with trembling fingers. But the letter, addressed simply, "To those who remain," was what truly silenced the room. The foreman carried the box to the rectory, where the parish priest, Father Callahan, carefully unfolded the brittle paper. The ink had faded, but the handwriting was unmistakably deliberate and graceful. It read, "If this letter has been found, then the hands that wrote it have long returned to dust. Yet I pray that what they carried may still be of use to you. These hands were not cursed, though many would have named them so. They were afflicted, yes, but not by God's anger. Suffering is not punishment, it is invitation. Through it, we learn the language of mercy. I did not hide my illness out of shame, but out of love, for I feared that fear itself would spread faster than any disease. If my gloves frightened you, know that beneath them I held no secret but pain. If my touch comforted you, know that it was not mine but his. Do not build monuments for me, build kindness instead. If you wish to honor my life, then see no one as unclean, no sorrow as too small, no heart as beyond healing. And should you ever wonder whether one broken life can still serve its purpose, remember this: a cracked vessel can still carry water, so long as it does not close itself. Father Alaric Byrne. When Father Callahan finished reading, the church fell silent. Even the workers, rough men unaccustomed to reverence, stood motionless, their caps pressed against their chests. The only sound was the sea outside, rolling against the cliffs as if echoing the letter's final line. For a long while no one spoke. Then the foreman whispered. He knew what people would think of him, and he still stayed. The discovery spread quickly through St. Brenton. Old villagers came to see the letter, tracing the faded ink with trembling fingers. Some wept openly. Others simply knelt in the pews, whispering prayers of gratitude. The story that had once been half forgotten was suddenly alive again, no longer myth, but truth preserved in ink and faith. Within weeks, the parish decided to restore not just the building, but also Father Byrne's mission. The small shed behind the church, once the House of Mercy, was cleaned and reopened as a free clinic for the poor. Its door bore a simple plaque that read, "Healing requires no permission." Villagers volunteered their time, doctors from nearby towns offered their services, and children painted the walls with verses of compassion. The legacy of one hidden man now reached generations he would never meet. A local newspaper covered the story under the headline, "Letter of Forgotten Priest Teaches Town the Power of Quiet Mercy." Soon, visitors began arriving from neighboring villages, some curious, others searching for hope. They came to see the gloves now displayed in a small glass case beside the letter, and yet no one viewed them with fear. Instead, they saw symbols of courage, the hands that had chosen to heal rather than hide. Among those who returned to St. Brenton was Clara Winslow, now an old woman with silver hair and tired eyes. It was she who had first noticed the priest's hidden hands in the photograph decades earlier. When she heard of the letter's discovery, she traveled from Boston just to see it for herself. Standing before the glass case, she whispered, "I knew there was something in those hands, something the world had missed. She placed a small bouquet of wild daisies, just like the ones little Margaret O'Reilly had once given him, beside the letter. "You were right, Father," she said softly. "Love is stronger than fear." Over the following years, copies of Father Burns' letter spread far beyond the village. It was printed in church bulletins, quoted in sermons, and even used in nursing schools as a reminder of compassion's quiet power. The original still rests beneath the altar at St. Mary's, sealed in glass but alive in spirit. Every year, on the anniversary of its discovery, the church bells ring twice, once for the man who suffered, and once for the mercy that survived him. And though the world continues to change, the lesson remains eternal, that faith is not found in grand miracles, but in small acts of unseen grace, that love, even when hidden, leaves a mark deeper than fear ever could. Father Burns' letter reminded the living that sometimes the greatest messages are written not in sermons or scripture, but in the quiet confessions left beneath the floorboards, proof that one life, however fragile, can still heal generations to come. The discovery of Father Alaric Burns' letter beneath the church floorboards in 1939 had changed everything in the village of St. Brenton. What began as a renovation became a resurrection, not of stone and timber, but of spirit. The once quiet parish that had nearly been forgotten was now alive again with meaning, each wall echoing with the priest's final words. "A cracked vessel can still carry water, so long as it does not close itself." The story of the hidden letter spread quickly, carried from village to town, from newspaper columns to whispered retellings at kitchen tables. People who had never set foot in St. Brenton now spoke the name Father Burn with reverence. To some, he was a saint, to others, a mystery. But to those who knew the full story, he was a reminder that the measure of a person's life lies not in what they achieve, but in what they give, even when no one sees it. In the years that followed, St. Brenton began to change in quiet but visible ways. The House of Mercy, reopened after the discovery, became a place of hope. It wasn't just a clinic, it was a symbol, a living continuation of Father Burns' compassion. Local doctors volunteered weekly, and even farmers donated portions of their crops to feed those who came for help. A faded sign above the door read, "Love needs no witness." Every evening, when the sun set behind the cliffs, villagers would light a single candle in their windows in his memory. To outsiders, it looked like a quaint tradition, but for the people of St. Brenton, it was an oath. To keep the priest's kindness alive in their own small ways, children were taught in school not only to pray, but to serve, to see dignity in every person, even in those society ignored. And when a child asked who Father Burn truly was, the elders would smile and say, "He was the man who taught us that broken hands can still bless." Clara Winslow, the historian who had first noticed the priest's hidden hands in the old photograph, became one of the letter's greatest champions. Though she was well into her 70s, she spent her remaining years writing a book titled The Hands That Blessed in Silence. It detailed not only Father Burns' story, but also the lessons it left behind. The courage to serve quietly, the humility to love without recognition. When the book was published in 1942, it spread beyond expectation. Soldiers took copies to the front lines during the war. Teachers read excerpts to their students, and families across America kept his quote pinned to their walls. Fear cannot stop a willing heart. Clara lived long enough to see the first edition sell out. In one of her final letters, she wrote, "Father Burns' voice was never meant for the masses. Yet the world has finally heard him, not through sermons, but through the silence he carried with grace." She passed away peacefully that same year. The villagers buried her beside the church at her request, under the same oak tree where Father Burn had once read prayers to the children. By the 1960s, St. Brenton had grown, new roads, new families, new ideas, yet the church remained unchanged. The photograph from 1891, showing Father Burn blessing the children, still hung in the hallway. The letter and gloves were preserved in glass beneath the altar, softly illuminated by candlelight. Every year, on the anniversary of his death, people gathered for the service of hands. It was not a mass of mourning, but of service. Villagers would arrive carrying small tokens, bread, medicine, blankets, and leave them at the altar for those in need. It became the heart of the community's identity. One of the villagers, Margaret O'Reilly's granddaughter, became a nurse. When interviewed years later, she said, "I never met him, but his story raised me. My grandmother used to tell me that kindness isn't something you choose once, it's something you choose every day, even when it hurts." In 1971, a historian from Harvard requested permission to borrow the original 1891 photograph for an exhibition called Faith in the Age of Fear. The church agreed, hoping to share Father Burns' legacy with a wider audience. At the exhibition, visitors stopped before the photo, a simple image of a priest with his hands hovering above a line of children. To many, it seemed ordinary, but when they read the story behind it, of the illness he hid, the love he carried, and the letter he left behind, they wept openly. The photograph was later dubbed The Hands of Mercy. A reporter for the Boston Evening Transcript wrote, "In a world that glorifies fame, here stands proof that the quietest lives often leave the loudest echoes." When the Church of St. Mary's reached its 100th anniversary in 1987, the parish decided to honor Father Burn in a way he would have approved. Instead of erecting a statue, they cast a new bell, named the Burn Bell, forged from melted offerings of broken metal tools, old iron gates, and even ship nails. When it first rang, its sound carried across the cliffs and out to the sea. On its rim were engraved his final words, "A cracked vessel can still carry water." That bell still rings every Sunday morning, a voice for the man who once could not speak of his pain. And every time it does, fishermen pause at their nets, mothers hush their children, and the villagers of St. Brenton bow their heads, reminded that mercy endures through generations. Today, in the 21st century, St. Mary's Church is no longer the isolated chapel it once was. Pilgrims and tourists come from across the world to see the letter and the photograph, yet those who live there say the true legacy isn't found in the artifacts. It's in the way people treat each other. The town runs free food drives every winter, a small clinic for the poor every summer, and a scholarship for young nurses called the Alaric Burn Fellowship. Each recipient is given a copy of his letter and a pair of white gloves, a reminder that compassion often wears invisible hands. On the back wall of the church, a newer plaque reads, "Not every blessing is seen, not every miracle is loud, but kindness that endures." As evening falls over the village and the sea mist rises, the glow of candles flickers through the windows of St. Mary's. The old photograph, now protected by glass, catches the light just enough to reveal the faint outline of Father Burn's trembling hands. And though more than a century has passed since that day in 1891, it seems as if the priest is still there, blessing the children, blessing the village, blessing the world with a grace that outlived him, because true legacy is not written in history books, nor captured in fame or wealth. It lives quietly, in the hearts we touch, the mercy we offer, and the love we leave behind when no one is watching.